Dear friends, we continue our discussion on genetics with my guest, mathematician and associate professor at the Department of Differential Geometry and Applications at the Mechanics and Mathematics Faculty of Lomonosov Moscow State University, Gleb Vladimirovich Nosovsky. In the first part of our conversation, we touched upon the fundamental aspects of the origin of living matter, raised the dilemma of intelligent design or spontaneous origin of life on our planet. For those who missed it, I recommend watching by following the link in the description below the video. Now, let's talk about what genetics can contribute to our understanding of the chronology, history, destiny, and path of human civilization, which is closer to us in time. Let's continue the conversation.
By the way, everything we discussed did not touch upon questions of the soul, whether it exists or not. We were discussing how to build a body. That was the only question we discussed. Even the body could not arise spontaneously, let alone the soul. Why can't we resurrect a person if they have died, and so on? These are separate questions that require separate research.
Can genetics provide something for chronology?
Yes, genetics can provide something for chronology. For example, genetics proves that there was no Mongol invasion of Russia. It proves that convincingly.
I was in Mongolia not long ago. They are very enthusiastic about the fact that they conquered everyone, that they were here.
They were not engaged in genetics.
They are certain that Genghis Khan was Mongolian. They have an airport named after Genghis Khan Square, a huge statue of Genghis Khan, a Genghis Khan museum. So, are you trying to disappoint our Mongolian friends now?
Anatoly Fomenko and I have long wanted to disappoint them by studying our history with mathematical methods. But genetics has disappointed them from its part. Because if their ancestors had come here, they could not have failed to leave traces of their Y chromosomes. It is impossible not to interact with local women at all.
In 300 years?
Yes, at least during the first years of conquest. It doesn't necessarily take 300 years. Conquerors always leave their genetic trace. And the genetic trace of Mongols is not traceable in us. We have an extremely small percentage of their Y chromosomes, and it's completely different from ours. Let me explain what the matter is here. The human gene, apart from its substantive part that encodes how to build our bodies, consists of many different chromosomes. One of them is the sex Y chromosome, which exists only in males. It is not passed on to females. It exists only in males. There is another gene that exists only in females. Well, not only in females, it exists in everyone, but it is passed down only through the maternal line. In other words, women pass it on, and men do not. This is the so-called mitochondrion. Through mitochondrion, we can trace the direct female line. And through the Y chromosome, we can trace the direct male line because it exists only in males. Sometimes there are errors in DNA replication. When a person gives birth to another person, if the newborn is a boy, he will have the same Y chromosome as the father. It is copied from the father's Y chromosome. But this replication mechanism can fail.
It happens with errors?
With errors. And if this error occurs in a significant region of the Y chromosome, most likely the child will be stillborn or deformed, or on the contrary, some kind of genius. But these cases are very rare, and I'm not talking about them now. I'm talking about cases where this error occurred in so-called non-significant areas of the Y chromosome. Usually, these non-significant areas are clearly visible. They are repetitions of the same letter. The same letter is repeated many times.
It's like a marker.
There is clearly no information there, but it's some kind of pattern. And this pattern can slightly lengthen or shorten, and then in subsequent replications, it is reproduced. This error is being copied, and it creates kind of a note that is passed down through the direct male line. And the pattern of these notes is the subject of study of our direct male lines through Y chromosomes. This research has advanced significantly since the discovery of the genome. Not just the discovery, but the discovery of ways to decode and read it. It's not that simple. Now they know how to read it. And the accumulation of errors in these lines is visible. We can confidently say that the lineage to which Mongols belong is not the ancestor of our lineage, nor of Europeans in general. In other words, if Mongols had been here, they would have left their Y chromosome behind, which would have undergone some modifications but would have remained theirs at its core.
We would have seen that.
We would have seen that, but we see that it doesn't exist.
And this can be strictly proven, can't it?
Yes, that's definitely true.
And it's a significant correction in our understanding of history through genetics.
Yes, genetics can reveal many other things. For example, it can reveal that the upper castes in India have the same Y chromosome lineage as the majority of Russians. The upper castes in the Middle East, all Arab countries, the upper castes have.
So, the leadership came from some common
leadership in the world, ruling castes, not even castes, lineages. Of course, there are exceptions. But in most cases, they have the Y chromosome that is common in our country among ordinary peasants. What our ordinary people carry, in distant countries,
the leaders carry. Also through mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome, it's possible to trace all of humanity to a common woman, a common man, our common ancestor. We are all distant brothers. Can we calculate when this happened?
You see, that's also mathematics.
Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosomal Adam, from a mathematical point of view, what are they?
I'll explain now.
Not who, clearly, it's some physical entity.
One needs to understand a certain paradox. A paradox is something that our intuition misunderstands. And in reality, it's not how our intuition perceives it. There is such a paradox. There are many of them, but one of them is as follows. Let's take some community. It doesn't matter who, humans, some reproducing beings. Let's say there are n of them, and let them die and reproduce infinitely long. This is called a birth and death process in mathematics. Let's assume that with a certain probability, according to some distribution, death and reproduction occur. It doesn't matter which distribution it occurs by. It doesn't matter how it's organized. In any case, assuming that this population will continue to exist if it hasn't already gone extinct, after a finite amount of time, with a probability of 1, only the descendants of one of these n individuals will survive.
I read somewhere an illustration of this. A village with a limited number of people tends to have one surname. In other words, if the surname is passed down only through the parent's line.
In fact, the strict statement is that either this population will exponentially grow, that is, explode, which, as we know, is impossible. If there is any finite restriction on it, then it will go extinct with a probability of 1, it will reduce to 0. But assuming it hasn't gone extinct, and we know that it hasn't, at some point it may go extinct, but it hasn't. So, assuming it hasn't gone extinct, after a sufficiently long time, only the descendants of one person will remain. In fact, this is a rigorous theorem. It can be proven, but it can also be explained to anyone. Let's track this population at each moment in time. Initially, we had n, and at each moment, we note how many descendants remain. from n minus 1. This is a function. Initially, it was equal to n because all these people were alive. But it is monotonically decreasing. It can't increase. It can only decrease. It can tend to either some global constant or to zero.
There lived a physical human, Y chromosomal atom.
Look, I'll explain. If there were n individuals, then the number of individuals who left descendants from that n decreases monotonically.
That's clear.
This can be proven. Intuitively, it's already understood that it should reach zero. And if it didn't reach zero, then it would reach 1 first. And I repeat, it doesn't matter which distribution it follows. It doesn't matter with what probability they are born. Therefore, if there is a population of people and we trace it back, then going further and further into the past, we can calculate how many common ancestors they have. How many common ancestors we have. At the level of our fathers, grandfathers, great-grandfathers. This number will decrease. And eventually, it will reach 1. It cannot reach 0. It will reach 1 and continue as 1 if we go back in time. That's why any population has a common ancestor. We have sexual reproduction, but that doesn't matter. We can consider only the males. Men beget men. If there is a certain number of males today, then in their past, along the male line, there is a certain number of ancestors. This number of ancestors will be 1 at a sufficiently distant point in the past. The same goes for the female line.
But can there be a pair like that?
But that doesn't mean that a hypothetical atom.
It's a hypothetical term.
Yes, it's a hypothetical term. It doesn't mean they lived simultaneously. No one claims that. And it's not the case. Modern genetics says otherwise.
There is a vast gap of years between them. It is believed to be tens of thousands of years.
There is a huge gap between them. Let's consider only white individuals. Because if we take blacks, everything becomes much more ancient in Africa. Direct male lines tracing back from the white population converge to a single point much earlier than if we include blacks.
I see.
For simplicity, let's talk about whites now. There is a white Adam. He is the common ancestor of all whites. And there is a white Eve. She is the common ancestor of all whites. This is true for whites. It is not necessarily true if we combine everyone. It is likely to be incorrect in that case.
So it's like a node on a tree.
What I'm saying is true for whites. The distance to white Adam and the distance to white Eve are significantly different. In other words, the distance to white Adam is much smaller than the distance to white Eve. And this is strange from the perspective of the modern historical framework. Because from the perspective of the modern historical framework, the male and female components are more or less symmetrical. If there is sexual reproduction within a community, then the distances to white Adam and white Eve should be of the same magnitude. Certainly, they are not equal to each other, but of the same magnitude. So, the mechanism must have been different. If we turn to the new chronology, everything is explained there. The new chronology asserts that civilization developed differently from what historians believe. There were separate centers in China, Egypt, and elsewhere. Many independent centers emerged in the world. And from these centers, civilizations grew and later expanded, merged, and intermixed. And we have the modern world. This is the conventional point of view accepted today. But the new chronology presents a different perspective. It claims that there was only one surviving center. Naturally, there might have been many centers in the past. Again, I'm only talking about whites. The new chronology focuses on the study of written history. Not because we don't want to, but because the new chronology lacks the tools to study the tribes of Africa and South America. That's why I'm not discussing them.
Nothing personal.
Our toolkit relates to civilizations with writing, which includes all white civilizations or Southeast Asian civilizations. If we look from the perspective of the new chronology, all white people originated from a single center. We indicate where this center was, how it changed, how its capital changed. This center expanded through military squads venturing into unknown lands without compasses, without maps, without anything, and most of them couldn't return home. They went somewhere, settled in new lands, and married local women because they were predominantly men. They formed an offshoot of the unified center, this unified civilization. And then, through comprehensive expansion, this primary center eventually covered those secondary centers that seemed foreign to it because during the time they lived separately, they could have undergone significant changes. It conquered them again during complete conquest, although they were their own. In other words, this center initially expanded through certain outbursts.
And then systematically.
And then the borders expanded uniformly, and it covered all these outbursts, releasing new outbursts and expanding again, covering them once more. That's how it all happened. And men came from this center. If this squad arrived somewhere, they would eliminate the local men. They would only take women for themselves, and this was the case in the Middle Ages. It is well known. They took women because they were necessary for procreation, and they exterminated local men. Therefore, in these centers which they formed, the male Y chromosome came from that initial center they all came from, while the female chromosome came from some other source. As a result, the male chromosome primarily came from this initial center because that's how the white race expanded. And the female chromosome, or mitochondrion, came from different sources.
That's why there is a significant difference in time.
Again, the smaller the community, the closer the common ancestor. The larger the community, the farther the common ancestor. If we look at the male community that forms the basis of our genetics, it is smaller. It emerged from this center and has a closer common ancestor. The female community is larger, and it has a more distant ancestor.
Is the genetic chronology based on the mutation frequency, the frequency of these distortions?
Yes, today they are trying to establish a genetic chronology and say that white Adam lived a certain number of years ago. But these claims, and I have examined them closely, are actually unsubstantiated and arbitrary.
Unreliable, one might say.
Not just unreliable, but roughly speaking, pulled out of thin air. specifically, pulled out of thin air because,
as I understand it, there's the hypothesis of the constant mutation rate.
actually, from a mathematical point of view, the task is not that simple, but it is entirely solvable. It is possible to measure the mutation rate in different regions based on the modern sample and then estimate how long ago white Adam and white Eve lived. From a mathematical perspective, there is no fundamental complexity here. Fundamentally, this problem is solvable, but genetics doesn't solve it. Instead, they present some loose reasoning and align the statements with their own authorities. Someone said that it happened at a certain time, and they align everything with that.
Even in the past 10 to 12 years, Y chromosomal Adam has aged around 4 to 5,000 years. So, if they used to estimate the time between Eve and Adam at around 50 or 60,000 years, now they are getting closer.
In my opinion, it's more than that, but it doesn't matter. In any case, from a mathematical point of view, these are not serious studies. It is possible to accurately estimate the distance to Adam, but it is not being done. However, that doesn't mean it's easy to do. Mathematically, it can be done easily. But obtaining the necessary data is extremely challenging. To do that, thousands, tens of thousands of father-son pair measurements need to be conducted, and the rates and probabilities of mutations need to be calculated on modern populations. It's preferable to calculate it over multiple generations because sometimes mutations can revert. That means a mutation occurs, but then it disappears. The human genome is complex. It sometimes reverses certain mutations. There is a random error. It exists in the son but disappears in the grandson. The grandson reverts back. It's not as simple as it seems. So, it can all be done, but it requires targeted research in this direction, collecting data specifically for mathematical analysis, and then conducting the mathematical analysis. But it's not being done. Why it's not being done is not a question for mathematicians, it's a question for geneticists. Instead, they pretend that everything is clear, referring to various historical chronicles and completely incorrect estimates from a mathematical perspective. Or rather, maybe the estimates themselves are correct, but they are derived from incorrect assumptions.
What are the major hypotheses in genetics currently that we would like to test or prove? Are there any objectives?
Regarding white Adam, it's an interesting question. It's clear that white Adam should not simply exist at a specific point in time, but it's more likely, based on probability theory and it's intuitively understood by geneticists, that he should exist in what is called a population bottleneck. That is when a small number of people survived a catastrophe. And since there are few of them, that number eventually reaches 1. When there are many, it will also eventually reach 1, but it takes a long time. However, if there are few, it reaches 1 faster. And if such bottlenecks exist, and we know they did, then with a higher probability, this atom would hang around one of them. It is entirely logical that they consider major volcanic eruptions as these bottlenecks. There are large volcanoes, not the ones that erupted in recent memory or in the 18th or 19th centuries. No, there are truly massive eruptions where the volcano's crater spans thousands of square kilometers.
A supervolcano.
Imagine the Toba volcano in Indonesia. They are trying to tie white Adam down to it. Its crater is now a lake measuring 100 by 300 kilometers. Calculate the area of the crater. And the depth of the throat is 100 kilometers. When such a massive amount of material is ejected into the atmosphere, it triggers what is known as a volcanic winter. Ash falls up to 10 meters high, covering everything in the southern regions within thousands of kilometers around the volcano. Sulfuric rains begin worldwide, pouring sulfuric acid.
People gradually go extinct.
Not gradually, but immediately. Somewhere, certain remnants accidentally survive in caves, in certain places. All this lasts for decades. Such a winter lasts for 10 to 15 years. Then everything starts to flourish again, surviving plants.
But from a small root.
What has survived all of this starts to bloom vigorously. On this ash, everything starts to grow rapidly, and everything is wonderful. But this paradise is only available to those who have survived. But even modern civilization will not survive such a catastrophe.
I think we won't even survive a much weaker catastrophe because, as I understand it, we have become weaker.
It's not that we have become weaker, but objectively a large number of people will not survive, and living beings in general.
I mean in a broad sense. Look, for example, if the Tuvans live in a yurt. Doesn't matter, winter or no winter. They don't need a satellite communication. They get in a yurt and go someplace else, and heat it with firewood. They have sheep, they have meat, they will somehow survive the winter. But now, if the power goes out in a city for about 20 hours, I think within a day it will turn into hell.
Absolutely right.
We won't be able to, we'll freeze. We don't have wood furnaces at home.
Absolutely right. During such a catastrophe, cities will be the first to perish, but not only cities. These catastrophes happen, and they leave behind the mouths of volcanoes, such as the Toba volcano. Somewhere about 60 to 70,000 years ago, it erupted, and such a catastrophe occurred. And they are trying to associate the white atom with it. And there are about 60 to 70,000 years between the white atom and us. So essentially, they fit it into the results. Maybe they themselves don't think so, but essentially, they fit it into the known bottlenecks.
And what about other events? What about different floods?
For a long time, there was no evidence of other events. But recently, there have been data indicating that a similar catastrophe occurred in 535 AD. In fact, not long ago. 535 AD is only 1,500 years ago. It is called the Proto-Krakatoa. There is a well-known Krakatoa volcano, located near Indonesia. This Krakatoa erupted in the 19th century and it is like a small pimple on the perimeter of the Proto-Krakatoa crater, which is underwater. So, it took a long time to find it. But recently, it has been discovered and linked to 535 AD. The year 535 AD has long intrigued many. Ice cores are extracted from the North and South poles, and in these cores, levels of sulfur or other elements are measured. In 535 AD, traces of a large simultaneous eruption were found both in the North and South poles.
So it happened on a global scale?
Yes. Additionally, there are studies on the rings of polar juniper trees that live for thousands of years. In their rings, an echo of that event in 535 AD was also found. Therefore, some kind of catastrophe certainly occurred in 535 AD. How extensive was it? I can say that the crater they discovered underwater has a diameter of 50 kilometers. A 50 kilometers diameter is certainly smaller than 100 by 300, but not by much. The order of magnitude is the same. Therefore, in principle,
it burst indeed.
yes. In 535 AD, a 50 kilometers diameter is larger than Moscow. Imagine the area of the crater, and usually the throat height is about 100 kilometers, from which everything spills out. That is essentially enough for a volcanic winter to begin and for any civilization to perish. So this itself is a nail in the coffin of traditional history. In 535 AD there was
literature, art.
Yes. Historians, however, as always say, well, you see, Procopius of Caesarea said that it was cold that year. They don't understand this.
Too cold for just Procopius of Caesarea.
It's quite possible that the white atom was exactly in 535 AD. This would largely correspond to modern scientific data. Sure, it all needs to be verified. And it can be verified. I can say that initially, they had certain notions about the mitochondrial DNA mutation rate. When they studied the remains of the Romanov royal family, they compared them using mitochondrial DNA. I think they compared them with the mitochondrial DNA of the English royal family.
Yes, the Spanish and English houses.
Yes, and then they realized that the changes in mitochondrial DNA occur 25 times faster than they thought. You see, 25 times. Let's divide 60,000 years by 25.
This could fundamentally change our understanding of chronology and therefore the entire history of our civilization. We thank Gleb Vladimirovich for his fascinating story. As always, he has pitched out plenty of thought-provoking topics. Well, for us philosophers, that's all we need. We eagerly await new discoveries that, undoubtedly, genetics will reveal as it continues to advance. We hope to see Gleb Vladimirovich as a guest in our club again. Thank you to everyone who was with us. Love wisdom. Strive for light. See you soon, friends.